House of Commons Standing Committee on Citizenship and Immigration. Today, for a briefing on recent changes to international student policy and plans for the future measures, we have with us the Honorable Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, Honorable Mark Miller, along with the officials. And first, I would love to, on behalf of the committee members, would love to welcome Dr. Harpreet Singh Kosher, who is the Deputy Minister. He's not new to the department. He's been ADM in the department, was moved to the others and came back. Dr. Kosher, welcome. And with us, we also have Ms. May. Ms. May is now a stranger to the committee, and welcome to the committee as well. Beside this, we have Aisha Jaffer, who is joining us virtually. Aisha, Ms. Jaffer, welcome to the committee. And we have two honorable members that I would love to acknowledge that they are here. With us, Mike Morris is here. Welcome to the committee. And also with us, we have Luke Berthold. Welcome to the meeting. And with this, we will directly go to the Minister. Minister, you have 5 minutes for the opening statements. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. I want to take my turn to welcome the team, and particularly Dr. Harpreet Kosher, who is the new Deputy Minister to this department and his first time in committee with me. I want to begin by acknowledging our presence on the unceded traditional territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. Je voudrais me présenter devant vous.
I'm glad to be back at this committee for the second time this month to discuss reforms to the International Student Program, as well as international student fraud, and an update on the task force. In fact, a number of people have asked me questions about it.
Dramatic increases in the number of international students that are arriving and hopefully studying in Canada. Some institutions have significantly increased the number of international students they receive to boost revenues without providing students with the resources and support that they need. Cette situation a rendu les étudiants.
This has rendered international students vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. We must have safeguards in place to protect newcomers while maintaining system integrity. That's why we've introduced reforms to the program to improve system integrity, support international students in Canada, and better protect them from exploitation.
As of December of 2023, we've established a mandatory letter of acceptance verification system for all post-secondary institutions to help protect students and institutions from fraud. We've also launched a task force to identify genuine international students who are victims of schemes around fraudulent letters of admissions, which we have seen as well. In January, we increased the financial requirement to $20,635. This measure will ensure that students are financially prepared for life in Canada and consequently less vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. Bien qu'il s'agisse d'une mesure nécessaire pour que les étudiants.
While this was a necessary step to ensure international students can support themselves, we understand that increasing the financial requirements may have a disproportionate effect on students from low-income and francophone countries. We're working on 2 pilot projects to mitigate that impact.
International students at private institutions that have curriculum licensing arrangements with public institutions will no longer be eligible for work permit upon graduation. Public-private partnerships are notorious for lacking oversight and as such do not provide the quality of academic experience that Canada is and should be renowned for. Non seulement plusieurs de ces établissements-là.
Not only do many of these institutions fail international students, they also jeopardize the reputation of Canada and its designated learning institutions as global leaders in education. These measures will safeguard international students, bolster program integrity, and maintain Canada's competitive edge in recruiting top talent.
International students make large financial and personal investments to come to Canada. Their families do so as well, and many intend to stay here as permanent residents on a path to citizenship. That is not always guaranteed, nor is it the point of the program. C'est là le cœur du programme. Nous voulons et nous avons.
This is the crux of the program. We want and need these students to stay in Canada and fill our labour gaps. However, unbridled growth has led to unprecedented numbers of international students in Canada. This jeopardizes the pathway to citizenship they expect.
Reforms, we've introduced a 2-year cap on new study permits. Provinces and territories remain responsible for post-secondary education, and they allocate and will allocate cap spaces to their designated learning institutions, which they can and should regulate. Les étudiants qui viennent ici pour obtenir un diplôme.
Students here for graduate degrees and PhDs, as well as primary and secondary students, are exempt from these measures.
Beyond the cap, we're developing a recognized institutions framework, which we've worked on with partners for a long time, thanks to the initiative of my predecessor, Sean Fraser, which we'll adopt in the coming months. Many institutions have not only promoted unsustainable growth, but also accepted students without the ability to provide proper supports, including housing, along with, at times, unethical recruiting practices. By penalizing the bad actors and rewarding the good ones, this framework will and should enable a smooth transition towards the abandonment of the cap if we choose to do so. The cap and other reforms I've mentioned today are not an end in of themselves for international students. On the contrary, they'll help maintain pathways to permanent residency and citizenship if they are available, attract and retain top talent, and ensure that students who settle in Canada have access to essential resources and supports. I should note that international students are not responsible for the challenges communities currently face in housing, healthcare, and other services. These are vital services all Canadians must be able to access, including the students that we welcome. As we welcome bright students from around the world, we're responsible to ensure they're prepared to navigate life and thrive here with support along the way. So thank you, Chair, and I will now take your questions. Je suis évidemment impatient de prendre vos questions.
I am obviously looking forward to your questions.
Sir, the honourable members, you've been very kind to me in previous times on the committee meeting. When we are having a discussion with the minister, I would make sure that I respect your time, and if you think the minister has to respond to your question, I don't want crosstalk, so as the interpreters can do their job effectively and with health consciousness. So raise your hand, and I will make sure that your time is respected that way. So with this, we will start with Mr. Kmich for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, in your comments, you have kind of outlined what the government has done quite late in the game now to try and resolve the problems created by a Liberal government after 8 years. And so I want to ask you specifically on international students, now that there's a cap of 35% that you've placed on it, a reduction, does the department know how many international students today are homeless?
So first, just to qualify your comment, MP Kmich, this was a program that has been supported by many governments, including Conservative governments. The Harper government doubled the program. It's one that has, yes, gotten out of control. We don't track the homelessness rates of students.
So I'll take it that you don't know how many are homeless right now. So you don't know that, although there have been stories all over the country of international students who are either sleeping in their cars on campus. In fact, the Nova Scotia Community College CEO said in the pre-budget meetings in the fall that he had students calling every single day asking whether they could sleep in their cars on campus while attending their post-secondary institution. It's on the record there. You have tent cities. You have people basically saying that they have nowhere else to live, or 25 people living in a home, all while the department kept issuing international study permits to these students. They promised them one thing, had a different experience in Canada. So why did you allow that to keep happening over the fall?
You know very well, MP Kmich, that education is in the jurisdiction of the provinces. Provinces regulate designated learning institutions. The only entity in this chain not making any money off it is the federal government. The provincial governments get their cut. The institutions get their cut. And we trusted provinces, we trusted designated learning institutions, and on seeing that this was getting out of control, we acted, and I think that's a very important thing to remember.
Are you saying you would have cared more if you were making money on it also?
That isn't the answer. My point is you talk about responsibility, but the responsibility is one that is shared by jurisdictions. And it is very simplistic to suggest that the federal government can simply turn on and off a tap and individually regulate institutions. Your own conservative governments would be the first to complain about that.
You did not include work hour limits in the announcement. You said those were announcements going to be made into the future. Now you said in your opening statement that international students are not to blame for the housing crisis in Canada. That's probably the only part of your whole statement I agreed with, that little small sliver of a few words. There is media reporting that the government was actually warned. IRCC officials warned at the Immigration Department that there would be an impact on housing if the international student program was not changed. And that was 2 years ago to your predecessor. Actually, I have the article right here. The guy who's still moonlighting, this gentleman's still moonlighting as a senior immigration minister all across the country. And he was warned 2 years ago that if changes to the international student program were not made, it would lead to increased housing pressure. Have you seen those briefing notes and memos that the Canadian press is reporting on?
Honourable Minister.
As a clarification, am I to understand that you didn't agree with anything in the opening statement about what is happening in Canada? You can't be oblivious to these.
Are you going to answer my question?
Well, no, I'm just talking to you about...
Did you see the memo, Minister?
I have seen memo upon memo about international students, and under my authority, I have acted on that, and that is what I plan to do and plan to continue. It is clear that we have issues in and around affordability and the cost of shelter and the impact of volume generated by some concentrations of students in some areas. But my announcement, to be clear, was not one that was to deal with affordability. It was one to
in the memo being quoted here by the
system.
Canadian press, it says, waiving the cap would help alleviate labor shortages. A memorandum for the minister conceded, but it could also have other unintended consequences. It then continues to talk about other issues that would arise. The memo said, quote, give rise to further program integrity concerns with the international student program. Minister, will you commit today to instruct your deputy minister to release all of the memos and the briefing notes and the internal documents being referred to in the Canadian press article here that appeared, the CBC no less, on February 13th, 2024. The headline is, Minister was warned about possible negative impacts of lifting international student work limit. Will you release them to this committee?
What I can say about this process and the process of decision-making is ministers are often briefed on a number of risks, the pros, the cons, everything in between, and we take a decision in light of that. I believe that the decision of my predecessor was the right one in the context. And then we have another decision
Chair,
that we must take
the minister,
in reducing
what are you
those
hiding,
hours
Minister? I'm asking you just to release the memo. Are you going to release the memo and the documents to this committee?
I'm not going to undertake at this time to
Honourable
release that
member,
information.
I will make sure that you get your time and let the minister respond, and I'll come back to you. Minister, go ahead, please.
I'm not going to undertake at this time to release those memos.
Because, Chair, the minister is hiding. He's not wanting to release the same documents that the media has access to and won't release it to all the members of this committee. Bloomberg, another media outlet is now reporting, they've compared the international student program, quote, to student trafficking. The very first line of this article says, Canada's radical immigration experiment. And it quotes you, Minister, saying, people are being exploited. Is this then your fault?
Look, I believe there is blame to share across jurisdictions.
Sorry, Minister, are you accepting blame for the situation? Are you saying your department and you have made decisions that have exploited international students?
That isn't what I answered, and you know exactly what I answered, Tom. I have said from time and time again that there is plenty of blame to go around. The primary responsibility for the quality of the education system are provinces. We trusted provinces. They did not live up to that trust, and now we are clamping down. I think that is the right thing to do.
Minister, then, do you believe that Bloomberg is accurately reporting on the state of the international student program in Canada, that it is indeed student trafficking, and again, quoting from the article, Canada's radical immigration experiment is an accurate reflection of your government's policies after 8 years?
Minister, time is up. Please.
There's clearly challenges with the integrity of the system, MP Kmeech. It is not the entire portrait of it. We do have some of the best and brightest students that we attract and compete with competitive jurisdictions about bringing them in. It is still a program that we can be quite proud of, but it does have abuses and at times has been a backdoor entry into Canada, and that's why we are taking these measures, which I believe are reasonable, and putting them into place. And that is something that I look forward to working with provinces and the institutions themselves so that we can live up to a visa program that was intended to attract excellence in the first place.
Thank you, Minister. And we will go to Madam Kaibaga for 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Chair. Minister, welcome back to our committee. It's always great to see that you're eager and willing to keep coming back to answer our very important questions. I want to start with just a quick question on what happened yesterday. The Ontario province claimed that they were blindsided by the cap that you announced in January. So my question, I guess, is did you get an opportunity to consult before putting forward these measures? And, smaller institutions that are in our community, such as, Fanshawe College, were they also consulted before these announcements were made?
So generally, MP Kaibaga, and that's an excellent question. We have had both privately and publicly plenty of opportunity to talk to provinces, including the province of Ontario, that has seen the absolute largest influx of international students in the past years. We've worked on with institutions directly on the recognized institution models prior to my arrival in this position. My colleague, Sean Fraser, has said time and time again and talked to provinces even before I was in this position that they needed to get their houses in order or we would act. There is a lot of speculation about who decided what, when, and how about the cap. Former Minister Fraser in this position, and now the current Minister of Housing, was one of the guys that helped me and convinced me to do it. And felt, and I think legitimately, that it was important to do the federal responsibility at this, which is at intake, continue to have a more robust mechanism in and around the control of fraud, the verification of letters so that people aren't brought here under false hope, the increase of the financial solvency requirements, which are key. It's not cheap to live in Canada, and we brought those numbers from 10,000 to 20,000 up to international standards or comparable to our competitors. And then this cap, which was the result of, frankly, intransigence from Ontario in particular, but provinces in general, to get their own chips in order. There is Auditor General report upon Auditor General report that has said this clearly with some measures the provinces have had to take. They haven't taken them. So there's ample time to have discussions. And looking at the sort of hockey stick curve that we saw in terms of the growth and the potential growth of international students from what is about 1 million today on a 3-year visa profile to 1.4 next year and even more. We were in the midst of creating a homegrown asylum crisis in Canada through the carelessness of a lot of designated learning institutions that have been improperly regulated. So we had a lot of those discussions, and there have been plenty of opportunities for partners to get engaged and object or anything along the spectrum.
And thank you for that answer, Minister. Obviously, we stated the obvious. Education falls under the jurisdiction of the province. But, smaller colleges like Fanshawe College, for example, have expressed that this is going to impact them financially, not just because of the cap on international students, but because the province will not increase the funding to support colleges and universities as they are supposed to. What would you say for, a college like Fanshawe College that needs answers?
The answers need to come from the entity that regulates them, which is the province. That may seem like something that may seem not nice coming from a federal minister, but I don't regulate Fanshawe College. I do understand and appreciate that colleges, universities, post-secondary institutions generally have been underfunded throughout the years by provinces. Ontario is one that stands out, and they have been smart and adapted and gone to get lucrative forms of increasing their balance sheets and increasing their coffers, but not in an unbridled way. It can't be that the post-secondary education system in Canada is bolstered almost entirely by international students, sometimes in higher proportions than the provinces themselves. That is not a sign of health. When we talk about asylum seekers, there were over 10,000 asylum seekers that came out of the Ontario education system in the last 3 years. That is a huge warning signal that I think is important for those colleges as they do their recruitments, have to refine their way of welcoming the students when they get here, but also making sure that they are that those students have the ability to live and thrive in Canada if they choose to stay here. So we're willing to work with Fanshawe College if they are willing to work with us in terms of falling into the designated, the recognized institution model, which will reward institutions that have good practices and good student experiences so that we are not doing what has been done up to now, which is exploit international students.
In your opening remarks, you talked about how the continued unbridled growth has led to unprecedented numbers of international students in Canada, and this really jeopardizes other pathways to temporary residence and to permanent residence and citizenship. Can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, and I think I know where you're going with the question. There are many pathways to becoming a permanent resident and by extension a Canadian citizen. Whether we do domestic draws from people that are already here or bring in talent from abroad is a function of the different programs we have under IRCC or what we have delegated to the provinces to administer. And so given the number of people and given the sheer volume, it is clear that not all students that wanted to stay here would be able to avail themselves of permanent residency, and that is not right. It is a young cohort, a bright cohort, and it's something that if we don't control the volumes at intake and have the proper accompaniments for those younger cohorts of the population, they are quite vulnerable, and I think that's something that we need to focus on as we infuse the system with a little more robustness.
Thank you very much, Minister, and thank you, Madam Kaibaga. We'll go to my dear friend, Mr. Bruno de Saab, for 6 minutes. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon, Mr. Minister. Thanks for coming. When you made your announcement on the cap for foreign students, there was a measure that really flew under the radar, but I think we have to look at. You said during that press conference that only the spouses of international students who are in a postgraduate or PhD or those who are studying law or medicine will be allowed to stay here. These are the brilliant people that we want to keep. Mr. Minister, are you saying that an American who is studying law at McGill is more brilliant than someone who is studying at Saint-Félicien to become a nurse in Quebec? What do you mean by that statement? I got my law degree from McGill, just like Monsieur Plamondon. I can say very confidently that no, I don't believe in that statement. So could you perhaps explain that quote? Because if the answer is no, thus far you've contradicted yourself compared to what you said during the press conference. May I explain, please? More often than not, those who apply at the bachelor level are younger. They are not married. Those who are doing a master's degree or studying law, it's not necessarily so in Quebec, where they can study law and medicine directly, but elsewhere they tend to be older, 24, 25 years old. That means that they could be married, they may have a spouse. So you have to understand that if those people want to come here as foreign students, perhaps they should be allowed to bring their spouse. That's understandable. Well, I just want you to qualify the answer because there's some work to do with the Quebec government. I indicated that wish to Ms. Fréchette recently, but it's clear that that cohort, those studying for their bachelors, it's kind of abrupt what you've just said. And if you look at how many students there were at the bachelor level or at a similar level, that number was untenable. And now we're trying to control the volume. I'm not saying that it's a perfect solution that can be justified by the provinces, but I think that if you have to look at it. Let me give the example of Saint-Félicien. There are 9 new students who came with their spouses and 5 have children. They're not 19 or 20 years old. And that doesn't explain what you just said. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. By saying that those who are studying law and medicine are more brilliant than others, I would like you to rectify that, because that is a total lack of respect for the students who are studying in other areas. Well, sorry, I didn't say that. Well, I'm going to have to look at that. Well, yes, you did say that, says Mr. Brunel-Duceppe. Well, I'm asking you to postpone the implementation of those measures because there are people who are worried. The situation in Quebec is different from elsewhere in Canada. I understand that this measure was to deal with what was going on in Ontario. That's most understandable. That's fine. The system in Quebec is different. We have professional education at the CIGEP level, and it's completely different from the rest of Canada. You know that yourself. You probably went through that system. So I would like you to make a commitment today to postpone that measure, at least for Quebec, to make sure that we can look at the real impact of this, because I think that means there might be 11 fewer nurses in our health system in my region in Lac-Saint-Jean. Do you want to have that impact? These are nurses who come from, nursing students who come from Cameroon. So I would like you to think about that and comment on it, please. Well, I think that if you look at Quebec's jurisdiction over education, I think you should go and look at the Minister of Education there and see if there can be an exception for them. If it can be done, certainly I can consider that, but we're talking about shared jurisdiction here. I'm ready to make exceptions if they are justified, but at the same time, we're dealing with a Quebec government that wants to reduce the number of temporary residents in Quebec, so they have to make choices. They should come and see me because it's important for everyone, especially people in the health sector. Well, Quebec is definitely against the cap of foreign students on the territory, so you have to be careful what is being said here because it's all registered. Do you have a good relationship with Minister Fréchette? Yes, but it doesn't mean we're always in agreement. Well, we're going to talk about good relations here. In 2017 and 18, the Quebec government spent money and didn't get as much money back from the federal government. And now we're getting to 2021, post-election. $135 million was received in Quebec, but less than that in Quebec. The Quebec government spent a lot more money than the federal government over those years. Why is it in 2017 you were giving us a reimbursement, but now you're not doing it? And how can you explain that you're having a good relationship when I look at those numbers? Well, I said I have a good relationship with her, but we're not necessarily on the same page all the time. Same as my relationship with you. With regard to the asylum seekers and what we do, there are federal and provincial responsibilities on that front. We are ready to work with Quebec, but we have to really break down the sums in question. And that discussion takes place nearly always in public. Thank you very much, Mr. Minister.
I think the bells are ringing. Yes. So you want everyone agree to go through the Mr. Reddycop?
Yeah, I would propose that we carry on. We're happy to give you C to do that. And then we just allow 5 minutes or whatever it takes to vote at voting time and just carry on.
Okay, so once the bells stop, then we will suspend the meeting for 5 minutes. And we can continue. So to do that, I will go to Madam Kwan. Madam Kwan, 6 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the Minister and his officials for coming back to committee again. I must first begin by saying, while I appreciate the Minister coming, I really do, and this is the motion that I had moved. I am disappointed, though, and I need to put this on the record, that the motion calling for the Minister to come to speak about Gaza and Sudan, in my mind, is perhaps the most urgent situation, and I would have had hoped that for the Minister to come and to speak to committee on that issue first. But that is not the case. I understand the Minister will be returning in March to deal with that, and so today we're dealing with international students. But because of the urgency with the situation in Gaza, I had hoped that we would be able to get some questions to the Minister and officials with respect to that. So with that being said, on international students, I also have to put this on the record as well. When, Minister, when you made the announcement of the cap, and this is in the backdrop of the media and others saying that newcomers are to blame for the housing crisis, I think it did a disservice for international students, the way in which this is cast in that context. I don't think that is the right message. I hope that that is not your intention. However, that is how it is perceived, that somehow newcomers, and in this instance, international students, are to be blamed for the housing crisis. Housing crisis, I will say, and I can talk all day long about where the housing crisis came from, which is, of course, 30 years of successive Liberal and Conservative governments relying on the private sector to deliver the housing that Canadians need, that they can afford. That's a conversation for another day. I want to touch on the international student, in particular, about the unintended consequences. Part of the announcement that came about with the cap, to which I do not agree with, is the notion that the applicants would need to demonstrate financial resources of $20,000 per year. So that's a shift, and now there are unintended consequences because there are students who come in on a scholarship, as an example. And the way in which this is calculated or dealt with, they may not be able to meet this new requirement now. And many of those who come on a scholarship, obviously, may well have some financial constraints. And those scholarships is what enable them to come and enhance their education and have those opportunities. In fact, my colleague, Randall Garrison, the member from Esquimalt Saanich Sooke, wrote to the minister about this, about Pearson College, with respect to scholarship for students, to which he has not received a response yet from the minister on this letter, and that was dated January 17th, 2024, asking whether or not IRCC officials would consider the total value of the scholarships, room and board provided by Pearson College to the students as a consideration toward that $25,000 requirement.
Honourable Minister.
So I can answer the specific question and speak a little more generally. MP Kwana, we're willing to look at it. I have not personally seen that letter. Maybe send it to my P9 after, and I can talk to officials about it. Look, the number that we increased was, in the grand scheme of things, rather modest. We were at half what our competitors were requesting that students provide as part of their solvency. We have clearly seen students that do not have the means to support themselves. So this is a choice. I think it's a very important choice, but it leaves students less exploited, given that they perhaps have more financial capacity to live and hopefully thrive in Canada. I acknowledged your point on Sudan and Gaza. I think if I were appearing today on Gaza, I would have no good news for you. I don't. I hope to have better news when we appear in 3 weeks, but there's no guarantees on that. I guess that's an aside because we're not dealing with that today. But it's not an attempt to dodge anything. I think these are very important issues generally, and we should have the opportunity to deal with them, and my presence obviously is required at times. I do not mean to stigmatize international students. In fact, if you look at it in economic terms, these are a large cohort of bright people, young, motivated, with financial capacity, and they're in Canada, and our demographic curve is tending in the wrong direction. The Bank of Canada has highlighted our singular ability to actually make that curve a little younger in the workforce, and this is notionally a cohort of people trained, potentially integrated, that we could leverage because of their talent and because of their work ethic. So notionally a good idea, but because of the real challenges in the volume that have been spiking, it was very important for Canada to pump the brakes.
I'll just quickly say that on the question around Gaza, I appreciate that maybe the minister's waiting to come and hopefully come with better news, but there are a lot of questions that needs to be answered, and each passing minute, people's lives are in jeopardy. I just want to say that, and they may not have the luxury of 3 weeks. I just need to put that on the record. On the issue around international students, you know, it's true. The former minister, which was a disappointment to me, that he was the Minister of Immigration, and shortly after he left and became the Minister of Housing, it was almost as though he immediately turned his back on the immigration file and started to point fingers. It is not helpful and not useful, and I am very disappointed with respect to that. Set that aside for a minute. I will definitely get this letter to the minister. And
Madam, if you can ask the last question.
Quite frankly, Sean Fraser is very passionate about his former file. I don't blame him for that. He had a lot of very important views that he communicated to me, and he helped convince me to put in place these measures to have a more robust system that we can be a little more proud of. And so I think he's one of my closest colleagues in cabinet, and we have some very important discussions on making sure that we are creating and bolstering a system that we can all be proud of. I take note of your comments, but when it comes to Sean's character, I think it's his passion for this file is one that I share.
he may be
Thank you very
passionate, but
much,
he's not
Minister,
helpful
and thank
when
you,
he turns
Madam
around
Kwan.
and blames
We will
newcomers.
go to Mr. Berthold for 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Miller. You will agree with me, and this is the first time that I've met you here in committee, but we've often spoken about immigration. The situation is absolutely dire. In the various ridings, we're spending half of our time settling problems that were caused either by delays, errors on the forms. There are an increasing number of foreign students who come to our offices, and yet we should be able to have recourse to immigration services offered by the Immigration Department. Most of my cases are of federal jurisdiction that should be settled by the department. Unfortunately, the system is in dire straits. How do you explain your predecessor's fiasco? With all due respect, and coming from the riding that is probably the busiest in Quebec, I understand your situation. I've seen it for the past 8 years. This isn't restricted to international students. It's mainly in May that we see students at our door. We are not the place of first resort. It's really people who are desperate, people who want to renew their visa. The problem is the volume. But how do we deal with this? Well, I'm not going to go back on what happened in the past. Well, Quebec was responsible for international students. It doesn't mean that there aren't any problems in Quebec. Look at the acceptance rate, look at the number of asylum seekers from the Quebec universities. It's quite a high number, but Quebec was responsible. The fact remains that there are a number of students, when they try to renew their visa, face challenges. We are trying to look at that. If you step back a bit, the student visa program is well managed in terms of the time frame. The problem is because there's so much influx. If you look at one part of the immigration that has problems, it wouldn't be this particular facet of it. It's not this program in general, but you have to say that generally there has been a fiasco here. You said yourself that in the past 3 years there's been exponential growth. There is some shared responsibility here. You said that it has been shared between the provincial and federal governments. So what is the federal government's share of responsibility here? There was a student from India who said that his request for accommodation was that his main fear in that was he wouldn't be able to find housing. How could you let things go? How could your predecessor let a situation get so bad? With all due respect, if an international student comes with $20,000 or $30,000 to show financial independence, I would say that the responsibility is the institution that welcomes that student, and then the province, and then the federal government. We do have a role to play, yes, a shared role when it comes to housing. And there are a lot of initiatives being taken, including at University of Laval and UBC, to invest in student housing.
Your time, so let the minister finish, and I will respect your time. Minister, go ahead.
Franchement, on est troisième sur la liste pour s'occuper.
Well, basically, we're third on the list to take care of student housing. It's not to say that we don't have any role whatsoever. We can certainly help provinces make investments. Who is responsible for issuing visas, Mr. Minister? Are you talking about issuing visas? It's very important, and that is why we are assuming a greater share of the responsibility, but it is mainly a provincial matter. Education is of a provincial jurisdiction. Now, are visas of federal or provincial jurisdiction? Well, listen, it's a very simple question that I'm asking. I am trying to ensure that there is housing for students. Minister, I know it's very difficult.
Stage, so I can acknowledge you fellows.
Okay.
Then it's easy on the interpreters, and I will respect your time. If you raise your hand, I will certainly acknowledge you. Okay, honourable member, go ahead, please.
Monsieur Miller, une question.
I have a simple question for you, Mr. Miller. Who is responsible for issuing student visas in Canada? The federal government is responsible for issuing student visas within an international study program. And who is responsible for the fact that the number of visas has gone from 350,000 to 1 million? It's not François Legault. Well,
C'est pas le premier ministre avec lequel je suis le plus
that is not the premier that concerns me the most, thank you, but we certainly relied on the institutions and the provinces who sent us visa requests. And with the new measures, we are asking them to take on and shoulder the responsibility for them.
Sir, no long answer, no long question though. Time is up.
Monsieur Miller, vous avez dit que
Mr. Miller, you said in a Bloomberg article, it said that students were being exploited. You said you had shared responsibility for this. I would like you to put your predecessor in the hot seat. These people should not be viewed as people who are abusing. We all have a responsibility to shoulder, but bear in mind that when it comes to people who have made money on the backs of those people, the federal government made nothing, and the provinces made perhaps 1,000, and institutions who have made 60 or 70,000 on the backs of these international students.
And I will go to Mr. Ali. Mr. Ali, go ahead for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister and officials, for coming here before committee. Minister, can you get into more details about how the international student cap works? How were the provincial allocations determined, and who is responsible for deciding if international students are issued a study permit by IRCC?
Thank you, MP Ali. It's important to take a step back in answering this question to understand that my statutory role and my statutory ability to create caps.
I have a hard time listening because there was a noise from the other side. So,
okay, we'll start the watch again. Go ahead if you want to say your question again, or you want Minister to start responding. I have stopped the watch.
thank you.
Do you want Minister?
Yes, please.
Honourable Minister, go ahead, please.
It's important to take a step back and looking at this cap to look at what my statutory abilities are, authorities are. I can only cap the applications and not the actual issuance of visas. So the way it works through the math is that we assume a level of acceptance and rejection at our level, and it churns out a bunch of visas. So what we did is cap the intake at a certain level, and then we distributed it generally by population across Canada. That has resulted in some provinces, Alberta, Quebec, and others, being able to potentially go up by 10%. We don't want unbridled growth, so we've put some limits there. It'll result in some provinces having to reduce in certain categories, particularly at the trade, these business degrees that have varying levels of legitimacy, and the undergrad level by 10, 20, 30, 35, 40% at times. It depends. We are still in discussions with the provinces, but what it has done in a spirit of equity is spread out the access to visas by province, which is very important because there were some provinces that were doing better than others and some that just really needed to get their ships in order. The second measure was to eliminate the ability to get for private public institutions to get postgraduate permits. Those are some of the ones that are the least regulated and subject to some of the most abuse. Hopefully that signs a bit of a death knell for those institutions. And the third was to limit the availability of spousal permits to those people doing masters and PhDs to attack a volume challenge, but also integrity challenges with what we believe was an area that was being exploited and not necessarily legitimate. So that was the spirit in which we did it. That was coupled with the measures that I took in the fall to increase the solvency requirements for people wanting to come to Canada. This is not the be-all and end-all. There is a lot of work. These are mostly quantitative steps. There are some qualitative steps that need to be taken by provinces in their own jurisdiction to make sure that the program can live up to what it was intended to be in the first place, which is to attract excellence and not volume, and not an attempt as attempts to get backdoor entries into Canada, or for certain institutions to triple, quadruple their fees simply because they're underfunded by provinces.
Thank you, Minister. Thank you so much. I was with you in Sheridan College when you first addressed this international student issue in Brampton. You came in as soon as you took over. It brought to your attention and you took action. Thank you so much for that. Minister, a few years ago, our government commissioned an economic report on the economic impact of international education in Canada. The resulting report indicated that in 2018, for example, international students in Canada spent $22.3 billion on tuition, accommodation, and discretionary spending, which translated into a $19.7 billion contribution to Canada's economy in that year. Ontario benefited from 55.3% of that contribution. The Economist estimated that international students annually spending in that year supported 218,577 jobs and contributed $3.7 billion in tax revenues. One of the other benefits to Canada is that international students support the hospitality sector by working in restaurants and hotels, for example. Is there a plan to compensate or counteract the loss of these contributions which might occur as a result of restricting the number of students?
15 seconds, Minister.
It's an exceedingly good question. It's hard to answer it in 15 seconds, Shefkat. We need to work with provinces to make sure that they are not chasing good money, chasing bad money for short-term gain and creating the long-term pain and impact that we've seen on our asylum system, or create a situation where people are undocumented here simply because we don't have the permanent residence space to accommodate them. The economic impact is significant. I think in large, international students are a huge contribution to the economy, but there are some actors sitting on $100 million on their balance sheets in some colleges, and that doesn't make sense in a system where largely domestic tuition is capped. There's something wrong with that, and I think we need to fix that at the risk of leaving money on the table. So we'll have to work with provinces to make sure that the unintended consequences can be mitigated, but we need them to work with us.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ali. And Mr. Minister, I will go to my dear friend, Mr. Brunel Seb, for 2.5 minutes.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In 2022, there was a study that was made on the unfairness of the approval for international students, Francophone African students, compared to the rest of the foreign students coming to Canada. There was a huge refusal rate, up to 90%, in fact. There were some recommendations that were put in, and that's recommendation number 15. Maybe you don't know it by heart, but it was that the intention to remain in Canada after getting their diploma or degree should not interfere with the issuing of the visa. Have you implemented that recommendation? No. But I can tell you is that with regard to the measures that have to be implemented to make sure that the students, especially the Francophones, stay here and have access to permanent residency, be favored, especially in the regions outside of Quebec where we want to encourage French. No, with regard to that measure, I haven't really implemented it. There is recommendation number 15 that says to, if they get a visa, their ability to stay in Canada should not be an obstacle. And you're saying now that people who come here first have to have a visa. And are you going to implement that recommendation, which was requested by all educational institutions in Quebec? We are reviewing it right now. I can tell you that with regard to the very low rate, that rate has increased recently, but there are measures that the federal government, that provincial government could implement as well. Now, that recommendation was made 2 years ago. It would be nice if it went a bit further. You are the third Minister of Education, of Immigration in the past 4.5 years. Do you find it quite normal that such an important file would be changed from minister to minister every 18 months? It's not up to me to make the decision. I think that I'm the best person for the job right now. But do you think that it is productive to change immigration minister every 18 months? I know Sean, Marco, Ahmed, even Mr. McCullum prior to that. To my mind, those people were very effective.
Mr. Bruno-Duceppe and Mr. Now we will go to Madam Kwan for 2.5 minutes and then we'll suspend.
We were talking about unintended consequences with the cap and also the $20,000 requirement in people's personal account. I wonder, when the minister made this decision and announced this cap, did the department undertake any evaluation of what those unintended consequences might be?
Honourable Minister.
It's an excellent question, and it was one of my largest preoccupations. First of all, the doubling of it was a no-brainer. We were just wildly under our international comparative countries. At the same time, when the recommendation came to me, I asked the department what we were going to do to make sure that people that from West Africa, for example, would not be unduly prejudiced by this type of decision, and we are looking at a number of solutions to make sure that people like that are not impacted by that decision-making process. It is no surprise that the diversity of the countries in question is rather limited, and the main source country is one, when you compare it relatively to other countries, that in terms of the global middle class does have an availability to mobilize money better than other countries where we would have equally excellent students.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I wonder if the minister can table to this committee the documents or documentation that officials provided to him with respect to the unintended consequences of this policy, not just on the $20,000 issue, but also on the other components within with this announcement.
I won't undertake to do it personally as the minister, but if the committee so decides to vote, we can look at that.
All right. In that case, I will move a motion to ask the minister to table documents in relation to unintended consequences with relation to the international student announcement.
So your motion is in order, so we can stop the watch on 2.5 minutes, and we will start the debate on that one. So,
I just want to get the documents.
is Mr. Reddycop? Pardon?
Let's vote.
Vote? Okay. If there is no discussion, we'll go to a vote. Mr. Clerk, could you call the vote, please?
So can you please clarify what are we voting on?
Okay. There is a motion on the floor from Madam Kwan that she is asking for certain documents to be tabled by the minister, and minister has said that if it is the will of the committee. And Madam Kwan, you want to read that motion once more?
I don't have it in writing. I just sort of set it off, but this is along these lines, that asking for the minister to table with the committee documents from his department with regards to unintended consequences in relation to the international student announcement.
Thank you. Is it clear? Any discussion? Okay, we go to vote. Vote, Mr. Clerk, please call the vote.
Okay. Mr. Ali?
In favor?
Mr. Chang?
In favor.
Mr. El Khoury?
Oh.
Madame Kayabaga?
Pour.
Once the vote starts.
Madame Kayabaga?
Pour.
Ms. Zaid?
Oui.
Mr. Kimmich?
Yes.
Mr. McGuire?
Yes.
Mr. McLean?
Yes.
Mr. Ridicop?
Yes.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe?
Oui.
Ms. Kwan?
Yes.
Agreed.
Carried. And Madam Kwan, you have 35 seconds. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I'll look forward to that. The reason I asked for that is just that I wanted to see what work is going to be undertaken and needs to be undertaken to address this issue, and I think those unintended consequences are serious. With respect to that, there's another piece which is another unintended consequences. So, for example, on the issue around students that are fleeing persecution, such as those from Afghanistan and other places, I know that there's a commitment from the government to facilitate education opportunities to them. But with this cap, this would also mean they would be impacted. Is that something that the minister will take into consideration to address so that those students would not be negatively impacted?
Yeah, that's
We've answered the
absolutely
question. Time is up.
one of the examples. Yeah.
Thank you very much. With this, I'm going to suspend the meeting. It is my understanding that Minister is here till 6:15. Is that correct, Minister? Or you can stay a bit longer?
I'm okay.
You okay? Okay, with that, then I will suspend the meeting and we will come back. And once we come back, I want you to think about the honorable member from the Green has asked for a unanimous consent if he can have one question of 2 minutes. Is there a unanimous consent, Madam Kwan?
Just on clarification here, the minister was meant to be here for 90 minutes. We were interrupted and started at least half an hour late because of votes, and we're now interrupted again because of votes. I would have anticipated that with the 90-minute rotation, I would have had another opportunity with another rotation with the minister.
Once the meeting is suspended, we can talk about it and figure it out if you want. Okay?
Yes, I would like to have another rotation because I have more questions for the minister.
So now my question to the membership is, as soon as we come back, is there a unanimous consent that the honorable member from the Green have 2 minutes?
No, sorry, we can't jump to having the Greens take a round without actually sorting out committee members getting their full round.
Then I'm going to suspend the meeting. We'll come back. the meeting back to order. Mr. Redikoff, for 5 minutes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I think we're all back. Mr. Miller, in September, the Senior Immigration and Housing Minister, Sean Fraser, said that the government wants to align our immigration policies with the absorptive capacity of communities, and that includes housing. So when the government drastically increased the international student program from 350,000 under Harper to the, and you mentioned the hockey stick, to 1.4 million that is now exists under Justin Trudeau, did you consider the pressure this increase would put on the housing situation in Canada?
Just on the characterization, I think it's clear that the federal government didn't drastically increase it. This has always, for 40 years, been a program that has not had a cap on it.
Did you consider housing when you were working with that program?
You know, I think what we did is we trusted provinces to regulate their designated learning institutions, and in a context where you're bringing people in with $40,000, $50,000 for an educational experience, you would expect those institutions to be responsible and provide access to housing. It's clear that when you look at the volume, and that's part of the reasons why we took this measure, there has been an impact of that volume on affordability and cost of shelter.
So I guess my point is, you said you took this measure, so you had data to do that. Did you consider housing when you took this measure, the data that you used?
Look, this was not a housing decision per se. It was an integrity of the system decision based on the challenges that we were seeing and the ecosystem that had been created by it. We can't deny the impact of the volume on affordability, notably the cost of shelter in certain areas. And indeed, economists have said that this measure that we took as a government currently to put the cap is probably one of our most important affordability measures that we have taken. So it is important, but it was not at the core of it. At the core of it was to make sure that Canadians could be proud of a system for international students.
So I'm still a little confused. So you're saying that you did take housing into consideration or you didn't? I'm not sure what you're saying. What are you telling me?
I can't help you with your confusion, but what I can say is that we knew what affordability challenges we were facing with respect to the large increase in volume in certain institutions that were perhaps abusing of a generous visa system that is regulated by the provinces.
The point of you coming here is to help clarify confusion that we might have here. So with respect, I think that's the purpose of you being here. So you're telling me then that you do not consider housing impacts when you are looking at the program and designing a program and deciding how many people should be coming into the country?
We are absolutely currently looking at that as part of our recognized institution models. What we did and what we should take responsibility for is we trusted institutions and we trusted provinces, and perhaps we should have scrutinized that a little better.
Honourable member.
So there's no system within your department for tracking or being responsible for what the impacts are on housing. It's not something that the department looks at.
Honourable Minister.
If your question to me, Brad, is do I make sure that every single student has housing? The answer to that is no. There is absolutely responsibility that lies within the institutions that are making 50 grand off these people to get them housing and to make sure they have the proper learning experience. I don't understand what part of that is confusing.
Honourable member.
So I've looked through the department reports that you have, and I've looked for anything to do with housing in there. And so when you're monitoring the output and the results of your staff, I don't see anything in there about housing. There is a little bit about asylum seekers and refugees in terms of dollars, but beyond that, it's clear that there's no consideration of housing when you are looking at your immigration plans and making decisions on capping, for example. So is that true, I guess, and is that the way the department works? It does not consider housing at all?
Honourable Minister.
By that line of questioning, I'll assume you haven't read the strategic review that I issued in the fall.
Do you know what Canada's vacancy rate was for 2023?
Pardon me? So, I didn't hear the question.
Do you know what Canada's vacancy rate was for 2023?
In which cities?
In Canada.
I don't know the general one. I know what the ones in certain cities.
It was 1.5% according to CMHC, the lowest recorded data ever. You previously earlier said that you didn't know how many students in Canada were homeless, which is another concern that we have. Did your department provide you with any research or any information documenting or predicting the housing situation of international students?
Honourable Minister.
We knew when we took this decision that there were pressures on those, particularly that were the most vulnerable. That includes students, and we had obviously seen and witnessed the stories in and around students that were packing in $5.15 to a house. Again, we're not talking about people that come here destitute. I don't ensure that every immigrant in this country has a house and I do not furnish them a house. A lot of 60% of people that come to this country under the economic categories go and find themselves housing. I think Canadians would react if we provided them with a house. They go in, they go on the market, they use the capital to purchase one. That's the way the system works. Now, with someone that comes in with capital like a student, you would expect them to find housing. Even more so, you would expect the institutions in question to go out and make sure that they have housing because those kids are vulnerable. So there's responsibility here, Brad.
Minister,
we are monitoring that
clearly
now, and that's why we took the measures that were important.
We do not expect the government to provide housing. That's clear. We agree on that. But it seems silly to me that the department and you as a minister wouldn't even consider the impacts that the numbers that you're producing for international students, for example, would have on students. Because as you said, they are not the problem.
And I will give the minister the floor.
That is a good question. I don't think it is correct to insinuate that we don't. We certainly looked, when we looked to stem the volume and spread out the international visas equitably by province, at the impact on the cost of shelter in certain jurisdictions, hoping that the provinces will actually take action on those institutions that have been the most egregious in leveraging the pocketbooks of international
Thank
students.
you very much, Mr. Redekop. We will go to Madam Zahid. Madam Zahid, 5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Minister, for appearing before the committee today. Minister, as you noted in your opening remarks, that international students are not to be blamed for our current housing and infrastructure challenges. In fact, what we have seen is that international students tend to be the victims of the housing crisis, as like many landlords have been taking advantage of them and charge an outrageous amount for like very cramped basement apartments. So how will these measures which you have announced ensure that international students are supported when they arrive here in Canada, and what role do we expect the institutions to play in this whole process?
You know, it's a very good point, MP Zaid. There is no denying that the increased volume of students has had an impact in an aggregate measure in certain areas in particular on the cost of shelter. When you look at occupation rates in my home city, those have remained relatively stable. The challenge we have faced is taking these correlative factors like the number of students, the volume of students, and others, and look at the causation. And I think that is an important practical, economic, intellectual activity. Trying to blame immigrants for housing is not only dangerous, it's false. You only have to look at areas with very low levels of immigration to see the cost of housing soaring. And so you can't pin that on the backs of students. Students are not responsible for the increase in interest rates in the past years. And to a large extent, I'm included in that, we have been able to secure relatively free interest on the debt over the last decade or so in the house that I have a mortgage on. So there are various factors that contribute to that. What we have seen, for example, actors like Airbnb should be held to account because that drives up the cost. And that is something that we could also analyze when we look at what the affordability challenges are in this country. Now, institutions that have been making a lot of money off these students owe it to themselves. They owe it to their institutions and their alumni and to whatever they represent to society to make sure that when they attract people that are paying 4 or 5 times the rate that my own children are paying at university, that they provide the proper living experience and student experience. That comes with a lot of obligations. It can't just only be cashing the check and walking away. And I think that is the important lesson to learn from this. The federal government has indeed a responsibility. It is by instituting some very rough measures of controlling the intake, but the responsibility, the qualitative responsibility, lies largely on the shoulders of the provinces.
Chair, thank you, Minister. Minister, as part of these new measures on the international students, like you also announced that the postgraduate work permits would be no longer issued for those students who are attending institutions with public-private partnerships. So can you please explain to the committee what public-private partnerships are and why this measure was put in place specifically for these institutions?
It's largely private colleges, predominant in Ontario, have partnered with publicly regulated institutions and thus been able to access and leverage postgraduate work permits. Those institutions, as you have seen, are largely non-regulated, less regulated than what public colleges and universities are. And they are the ones that have been in part responsible for some of the inequitable growth and in the issuances of visas and postgraduate work permits. So there was no longer any reason to issue postgraduate work permits to those institutions.
Honourable Member.
Thank you, Chair. Like, just a very quick question in regard. I've been, since these programs have been announced and these measures have been announced, I've been getting many inquiries from those people, students, like undergrad students who had already applied for their spouses' work permits. So those work permits, like for the spouses, for the undergrad students which are already in the system, like what will happen in regards to that? Will those be processed or?
Yeah, this is it's a going forward measure, members aid, and those ones should, unless I'm mischaracterizing your question, they should be accepted.
Thank you very much. You have only 1 second left. So with that, I will go to Mr. Morris for 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
Alors, je veux dire merci à mon ami, M.
I would like to say thanks to my colleague, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe.
Really appreciated working with your office in light of the fact that of the 3 post-secondary institutions in my community, one of them has approved over 30,000 study permit applications in 2023, more than 1,600% jump since 2014, and our community doesn't have the necessary infrastructure to receive that exponential jump. I appreciate that. I feel like you've really heard some of the measures I brought forward in a motion back in the fall to address this, including doubling the minimum financial requirement for students who arrive. My question is with respect to one of the measures that has not been taken up yet, and that's to have IRCC consider limiting visas and permits to an institution if more than 15% of the international students they accept never actually enroll in a course or withdraw from their studies or transfer out. And this is something that has already been put in place by other signatories of a global agreement on ethical practices of recruiting international students called the London Statement. Can you comment on your openness to continuing to pursue this measure as part of the plan to do more with respect to the recognized institutions framework?
Yeah, and it's a really good question. Thank you for working with my office on these measures. They are largely measures that are extremely important. As I mentioned to your colleagues, some of the more important affordability actions we've taken as a government, but they're not the end of the story. And we have to, within our role, and I have to continue to remind myself of what my role is as the Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship, to make sure I am ensuring that provinces are exercising their responsibility, institutions themselves, and there is a large field to occupy there. But if it is not occupied, we are prepared to take additional measures, including looking at factors and equations. We've seen all sorts of different metrics that would inform whether an institution is a recognized institution going forward, and to give them preferential treatment for visa if they can show that the students have the proper experience. So we're willing to entertain further actions, and if you have further suggestions, please work with my team on that.
You have 5 seconds, Mr. Morris.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Madam Kwan for 2.5 minutes. Please go ahead.
On the question around student housing, I actually think that it is essential for institutions and provinces do their part. And I think the federal government should show leadership and perhaps initiate a program wherein the federal government contributes 1/3 of the funding and institutions provide 1/3 of the funding, and the provinces and territories provide 1/3 of the funding towards the creation of student housing, and both for international students and domestic students. And that way you can have a robust plan to address the housing needs of the students. I'm going to park that for a minute and quickly get into the students that were subject to fraud. We have a situation where students have been now cleared and found to be genuine by the task force, but they have not gotten their passports back yet. And I don't know what the holdup is, and I wonder if the minister can comment on that. And second, for those students who are still waiting to be evaluated by the task force, and the task force work can't proceed because they might be waiting for a date before the IRB to assess the question on their permit and on whether or not it was genuine or whether or not it was, if there was misrepresentation. So you're now consequently in a situation people are just chasing their tail and they can't get to the task force. So so on that question, will the minister agree that instead of making people go through that process with the IRB, move forward with the task force evaluation first, and then, and so that they can be found either they're a genuine student or not a genuine student?
You've asked me a lot of questions in 2.5 minutes. There's a lot. You'd make a great reporter, but you're already a great MP. It's a lot of shotgun questions there. I want to give you a proper and fulsome update on that task force. We can get to the bottom of the passport issue, but glad to. I have an update for you that I could provide either as a sidebar or more officially through channels. But again, point taken on the passport issue, and we will follow up on that. I don't have an update for you on that.
And what about the whole idea of actually doing the task force work first, instead of making the student go through the IRB assessment on misrepresentation? Because as long as the task force has not finished its work and they're not known if they're genuine or not, making them go through the other process, they're just going to spin their tail, because that misrepresentation piece is always going to be on their file.
Time is up, Minister. Brief.
We can, MP Kwan, I won't do justice to your question by answering it really quickly, but we can follow up on that.
Thank you very much, Minister. Minister, thank you for staying late with us today to accommodate the honourable members, and thank you for being accessible to this committee, and hopefully you will stay accessible. With that, thank you to you and your Deputy Minister and Assistant Deputy Ministers. With that, I will call the meeting, adjourn the meeting. Yes. All in favor? Come on.